When eventually the Egyptians retreated and ceased to control Kerma, a new kingdom arose further south from Kerma in Napata, or Nabta as the Sudanese call it.
My own opinion, they moved to Nabta for economic, political, and religious reasons. Economic reasons because Nabta was a meeting place for trade. The population was growing. As they were already urban, they needed more resources. More resources were available in those to supply an increasing population. And religious reason, Jabal Barkal is a sacred mountain which Egyptians and Kushites believe that Amun resides in Jabal Barkal.
The god Amun-Ra.
The god Amun-Ra. So it is sacred for the Egyptians and the Kushites.
The Kushites' new kingdom at Napata is near the modern-day town of Karima by a mountain known today as Jabal Barkal. Their move coincided with another decline in Egypt, which had become so engulfed in its own internal rivalries that it paid little attention to Kush. This meant the kingdom at Napata, which began in El-Kuru, could develop undisturbed.
As the civilization of Nabta evolved from Al-Kuru, it starts as a small chiefdom and developed to a kingship and later on developed to an empire.
By the 8th century BC, the kings of Kush were growing ever richer and more powerful. At the Kushite capital of Napata, the mountain dominated the landscape, much as it does today. In its shadow, life goes on in El-Kuru. Time, I think, to abandon the open desert in search of human inhabitants. I want to get a feel for the kind of settlements that existed in the ancient kingdom of Kush and how far some of the ancient customs and practices still exist in modern-day Sudan. So I've been asking the ladies of the house to show me things which I know were used in the era of the Kushites and which I know are still used today. And this is what's known as a zir, and this was used in ancient times to keep water cool. So I find it absolutely fascinating that I can find an old house like this that is just so evocative of that period of Sudanese history. You can see the traditions of the Kushite kingdom still living on in the people who inhabit this area. People here eat the same grains and use similar earthenware storage urns. And the style of beds is one that has been in continuous use since ancient times. I remember beds like this from decades ago in the Sudan, but of course people have since moved on and tend to use mattresses, which is why I suppose why this has just been used as a repository for dates.
So the wooden bed have an important significance to the Sudanese community through the whole period from Kerma, from 2500 BC up to now, because it have a significance in the daily life for wedding, the bride and groom. The ceremony started on a wooden bed, we call it angareb, and even for the circumcision of the boys, it was used. And finally, it was used to carry the deceased. If somebody dies, he will be carried to his final destination by a bed.
I've come across a wedding party in a settlement at the foot of Jabal Barkal. The men are gathered waiting for the ceremony to start. I reckon I can seize the chance to go and visit the women at the wedding breakfast to see some female customs that have endured throughout the centuries.
ازيكم اهلا وسهلا عايز اسلم على العريس ازيك هذاك العريس شكرا.
The bridegroom very helpfully takes me across the road to meet the ladies.
I'm just looking at this lady's hands with the henna and the beautiful gold. Two things that we had, of course, in the Kushite kingdom, the gold and then, of course, the henna. The women of Kush dipped their hands in henna, decorated it, and they also wore coal on their eyes, like this lady here. And this is the holder that the coal is kept in today. And the bridegroom's aunt, Samira, is going to show us how they would use it. Amazing. She did it without any mirror.
Kushite women, like one famous princess who lived in the 8th century called Amanirdis, wore elaborate jewelry. She probably had fine gold rings, bracelets, and colourful beaded necklaces like these in the National Museum, some made of ostrich eggshells. Amanirdis would have worn her hair flat to the head with a top knot, her long nails stained with henna, and her eyes darkened with coal. So you can see the continuity of tradition is very much alive amongst the women at the wedding preparations. And you can also see it in the very masculine pursuit of wrestling, an activity which has stood the test of time. The Kushites were renowned wrestlers and were held in high esteem for their skill and fighting ability. Today in Sudan, especially in the Nuba Mountains in the southwest of the country, wrestling tournaments are held regularly. In days gone by, the Kushites would have engaged in such wrestling matches for sport. These local young men are clearly letting off a bit of steam as well as entertaining spectators. By the early 8th century BC, ancient Egypt's fighting capability was much diminished. The country had grown weak and it could no longer ward off invaders. Egypt came under the rule of princes from Libya who had their own traditions and religion and had no regard whatsoever for those of the Egyptians. This was a source of great dismay for the Kushites. Through centuries of interaction, the Kushites had a religion and culture similar to the ancient Egyptians. They spoke their own Cushitic language, though they used Egyptian hieroglyphics for writing. By 750 BC, the Kushites had had enough of the decadence of the Libyan princes and their allies in Egypt. At that time, Kush was ruled by a king called Kashta, and he believed it was his duty to save the Egyptians from further ruin. So he decided to invade Egypt. We don't have any depiction of Kashta, but presumably he was not unlike the kings who succeeded him. Kashta's ambitions in Egypt were limited. He simply wanted to protect the religious center of Thebes, modern-day Luxor, in southern or upper Egypt. King Kashta was a force to be reckoned with. He owned the gold mines in Kush and controlled the River Nile and land routes for luxury goods like ebony and ivory from further south in Africa. At his base in Napata, between the 3rd and 4th cataracts of the River Nile, around 450 kilometers north of the modern-day capital Khartoum, Kashta ruled over a flourishing community of Kushites. King Kashta's main place of worship was at the nearby temple of Jabal Barkal. From a distance, it's imposing, and as you get nearer, you can begin to make out the well-preserved remains of the temple. Kashta's army was renowned for the skill of its horsemanship and its archers, who would dip their arrowheads into poison to make them more deadly. Their speciality was to shoot their opponents in the eye. Kashta's army first took Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt. For the most part, the Kushites were welcomed by the locals there, grateful that their co-religionists were seeing off the heathen Libyans. With Thebes secured, Kashta could rest easy. 3 years after he'd begun the campaign into Egypt, King Kashta died. He was buried in Al-Kuru in his homeland of Kush.
Kashta's body was mummified in the Egyptian fashion and placed in a highly decorated wooden coffin covered in gold foil with inlays of coloured glass and lapis lazuli. His body was placed facing east in the direction of which the sun rose, and the coffin was placed in a grave like this, above which a huge pyramid would have stood.
As befits a dead king, Kashta would need a large number of grave goods for the afterlife. Pottery, personal ornaments and jewelry were buried with him beneath his pyramid. The Kushite pyramids differ from those in Egypt. They're smaller, steeper, and made of red sandstone. There are 1,000 pyramids that have been discovered so far in Sudan, though only about 300 of them are still standing as pyramid structures. In Egypt, there are about 100 pyramids.
Our pyramids, the Sudanese pyramids, have different aspects because their angle of building is very steep compared to that of Egypt.
We know that the kings and queens of Kush were buried with all manner of personal belongings and furniture, and also shabtis, which are these figures of people who would serve them in the afterlife. Were they actually ever buried with real live human beings?
This is the idea of accompanying the deceased, because in one grave, in 1916, in one of the kings of Karma grave, some of the deceased were covering their faces with their hands. So it means that these people were maybe put into the grave, intoxicated or drugged, and put to accompany the king. In the later period, there is no indication of intentional accompanying of the king, but they put the shabtis to serve the king in the afterlife.
These pyramids here by Jebel Barkal are an example of how pyramids were looted both in antiquity and in centuries later to come. The tips of these pyramids are believed to have been covered in gold foil, where clearly now the tips have been destroyed and the gold removed. Kashta's reign as king of Kush had lasted around 13 years. However, it was his son Pianki who was to take further the mission his father had started. Pianki was crowned king at the temple of Amun in Jebel Barkal, probably in 747 BC, and he ruled for about 30 years until around 715 BC. Much of our knowledge of Pianki comes from his stela, a massive slab of dark grey granite with 159 lines of text in Egyptian hieroglyphics, known as the Victory Stela. It sets out how Pianki first defeated and then ruled Egypt through establishing separate principalities. The stela begins with Pianki's words.
Hear of what I did. I am a king, divine emanation, living image of Atum, who came forth from the womb adorned as a ruler, of whom those greater than he were afraid, whose father knew and whose mother recognized that he would rule.
Under Pianki, Egypt came further under Kushite control. However, when he heard about a key victory by his army, he was not content, because some of the Egyptian princes had escaped to the north of the country. Pianki vowed to go into battle himself, as recorded in his stela.
I shall make the Northland taste the taste of my fingers.
Pianki pursued the Egyptian princes north and laid siege to them in their stronghold of Hermopolis. They eventually surrendered. After his victory, Pianki searched through the palace for treasures.